Welcome, lifetime learners. We are back for our second virtual lunchtime lecture, and this is going to be a good one. American Sherlock, Murder, Forensics, and the Birth of American CSI. Before we get started, I want to give a quick shout out to all of you who donated to the Texas X's when you registered. Thank you so much. Your support during these challenging times is invaluable. You can always give at texasx's.org/donate. Now, on to the show. This month's professor, Kate Winkler Dawson from the Moody College of Communications, is going to tell us the riveting story of the birth of criminal investigation and discuss her new book. With almost 25 years in television news, Dawson has worked as a field producer, line producer, and a writer for some of the top outlets in the country. She holds a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University, was on the faculty at Fordham University's Journalism School in New York for 2 years, and has taught at UT in the Broadcast Journalism Department for almost 9. In 2014, Dawson wrote a book called The Digital Reporter and her debut nonfiction book called Death in the Air, the true story of a serial killer, London's Great Smog, and the strangling of a city, was published in 2017 and optioned for television development. Her newest book is called American Sherlock, Murder, Forensics, and the Birth of American CSI. Please welcome Professor Dawson.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. I love this group, so I'm honored to be here. I was honored to be asked. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I found the second book and a little bit about what I do and different projects that I have. And then we're going to open it up for questions in the chat. So, most people want to know where I find the ideas for my books. So my first book was called Death in the Air. And it was about a serial killer who was stuck in the Great London Smog of 1952, which was the world's deadliest air pollution disaster. It killed almost 12,000 people. And so this was an event, one big event with multiple real life characters in it. So I had found a woman who's now a grandmother who was a little girl at the time and her father died because of the smog. There was a police officer, there was a doctor, and then of course there's the serial killer, because what I really enjoy writing about is historical true crime. So big crimes that happened that you might not have ever heard of, but were big crimes at the time. And that had significance there at that time, either, legally or culturally. And then the story has themes that resonate with us today. So in the case of that book, it was air pollution and wrongful conviction. And a time period that I love, 1950s London, is fantastic to write about. So that was one big event with multiple people inside telling the story, all different points of view. So for the second book, I really wanted to do historical true crime, but I didn't want one event. I wanted it to be about multiple events told through the lens of one person. And I knew that I wanted a forensic scientist. So my father was a law professor at the University of Texas for 37 years before he died in 2005. So if any of you went to law school at UT between 1972 and 2005, you might have had my dad. His name was Robert Dawson. And he and I used to talk all the time about forensics, about bad forensic science, junk science, wrongful conviction, why people were in prison for things that they didn't do. And so he started the Texas Center for Actual Innocence at the law school. And I eventually joined the board after he died, and I taught a class there. So this was sort of in my blood. And my mom is a clinical psychologist. So if you put those two things together, you end up with me, essentially, who was a journalist who reported on a lot of crime, but ultimately, I really settled in on doing general reporting, but I always wanted to go back to crime reporting. And so when I started full-time faculty at UT and I had kids, I really wanted to dive into book writing. And so, I had the first book and was a success. And so the second book, as I said, I really wanted a forensic scientist. And so I just did something it's embarrassing to admit, but I'm going to show you this. I have a visual that's going to throw everybody off. So I did this. I got this book, and you can't really read it. And I actually shouldn't show it to you because I'm convinced that every book that I write about is going to be somewhere in this book. So it's called Blood Letters and Bad Men. And it's essentially an encyclopedia for every criminal in the United States, starting from the Pilgrims, because there was a killer on the Mayflower, all the way until the 1970s when the book was published, which is perfect for me because I am not really interested in any time periods that come after, I would say, the 1950s. And honestly, the 1950s was pushing it for me. The older, the better. I would love something in colonial America if I could find it. So when I was on a page, probably about 100, I read about a story that I'll tell you in a little bit about. It's about a botched train robbery by the 3 worst train robbers in the history of America, I'm pretty sure. But within that story, I read about the razzle dazzle of this forensic scientist who took a pair of overalls and found 20 or 30 clues that federal investigators hadn't been able to find during this train robbery in 1923. And the moniker that they called him in the book is America's Sherlock Holmes, which of course immediately got my attention. And when I am sort of intrigued by something like what happened with the Fog book, the first thing I do is try to figure out what the archive is. So in the list of things that are important to me when I bother my literary agent or my editor about this is, what I think the next book should be, there's like a big checklist that I go through for my particular books. One is, has anybody really ever heard of this event? Is this something that's going to be fresh and new? And I quickly found out that this man, Oscar Heinrich, Edward Oscar Heinrich is his name, never even had a Wikipedia page. So nobody really knew about him except in kind of obscure books about the history of forensic science. There was not a lot of general knowledge after he died in 1953 about the work that he did. So the next step for me is, finding out what the archive is like. And that's the most important thing. So I'll look at a couple of different websites. I don't know if anybody's interested in research in that way, but I go to WorldCat.org, which is what a lot of people use. And I had a archivist tell me about, it's called Archive Grid. I think it's .com. Archive Grid, where you can actually, if you want to do a book on a forensic scientist, you can type in the phrase forensic scientist, and it will tell you every archive that uses that as a key word within, the different collections that it has. So if you're bound and determined to do a story on a criminologist, you can plug that in and find out what your different possibilities are. And I've actually used that a lot. So I went to WorldCat, I plugged in his name, and I found out, lo and behold, he has this incredible archive. So let's move to the next slide so you can actually see this guy I'm going on and on about. So this is Edward Oscar Heinrich with he's cleaning a gun in his office. And so you see all the books behind him. He donated, after his death, his estate donated, I think UC Berkeley has 2,000 books, which I'm assuming are most of those also, to the library, along with the largest collection that I have ever dealt with. With the Fog book, there were these internal memos between the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Housing where they were blaming each other essentially for the Fog. And so I had all these great internal memos. I probably had 300 or 400 that I was able to synthesize in that book to be able to create this narrative of a lot of cover up and blaming within Churchill's government because of the smog. And then with the serial killer, there was a huge amount of material in police reports. So I was able to work with a lot of material, but this was a whole new level. So the things that I walked away from just looking at Oscar's collection was that he for sure had OCPD, obsessive compulsive. I mean, there's definitely no getting around that. I've never seen a collection like this where he kept everything, but he kept everything that had to do with, his personal life, but also in his case files, every little tiny thing he wanted. But that was not the OCPD part to me, even though I think it is totally to normal people. The big part for me was that because what I found out a little bit later about his family history, his father ultimately took his own life because of financial issues. And Oscar was 16 at the time and found his dad. And that was his first experience with a dead body. And I actually didn't find that out until about a month before the book was due. And it put everything into perspective for me about this man's life. But when I walked into the archive, there were probably 75 to 80 huge leather-bound journals. And they were journals where he chronicled every single penny that he spent. From, I think from when he graduated from college, which was like 1908, all the way till he died. So every penny, and I mean, like, gas was 12 cents, a loaf of bread was 5 cents, like everything that you could think of from between 1908 and 1953, he chronicled, to a point where it must have just been overwhelming for him. But I think that was his way of staying sane. And so, finding that sort of overwhelming amount of financial information, and then placing that with, to get into his personal life a little bit, here's this man who closed 2,000 cases in his lifetime, which is incredible. He also taught at UC Berkeley for, decades. He was taught the first criminology classes in the country, and they call it cop college. So he would teach police officers and investigators and attorneys how to investigate cases properly. So his skills were unparalleled. I mean, they were incredible, but his personal life and what was happening in his head were really difficult. He journaled constantly. He even journaled when he journaled. So I found an entry that said 8 p.m. journalizing at the time, which is really, I mean, that's hyper organized. He journaled when he called it his night pipe, when he took his pipe at night, when he napped, when he woke up. He spent a year charting his urine levels for some kind of experiment he was doing. So, it was an interesting digging. It's always interesting digging in somebody's life when you're trying to do a biography, but Oscar's was really fascinating. So this gun was either similar or the exact gun that was found in the archive. So the archive had been closed for 65 years. He died in 53. His youngest son donated, I think he just took whatever a U-Haul was in 1960 and dumped it in front of UC Berkeley and said, good luck, because it was more than 100 boxes full of stuff. And one of them, well, there were 3 guns, but this looked like one of them, very similar to one of them. And they all had bullets and they all had firing pins. So they were loaded guns. And UC Berkeley, until I sent a form that said, you need to open this archive. I know it's going to be a pain, but this man is worthy of an archive, of opening your archive, and I could do a book about him, and I'm with a real publisher, and this will get a lot of publicity. And when they finally agree to do it and they get into this archive, these loaded guns are here. He has evidence that he shouldn't have ever had. And when I was there doing research, we'll talk about Fatty Arbuckle, I think, in a second. He was a big star in the Fatty Arbuckle, the silent film star case, who was on trial for manslaughter. I picked up, when I was at the archive, I was in the warehouse. I wasn't in the library. If you've ever gone to a library and done research where you fill out a form and you get a box and it takes forever and then you only get one box at a time. I didn't have time for that. So they agreed to let me come to the warehouse and sit there with the archivist, who was still cataloging everything and giving box numbers. And I would go and get something in a box, and I got into Fatty Arbuckle's case file, which was a really big box because it was a major case. And I pull out this lock of hair and I said, what is this? And she said, is it blonde? And I said, yeah. And she said, that is Virginia Rapay's hair. So Virginia Rapay was the kind of the B-list movie star who Fatty Arbuckle was accused of killing. So, these are all things that should be sort of like vacuum sealed and protected. And they didn't do things like that back then, but he had just like this, for somebody who writes about this stuff, the visual effect of, being able to pick up a clump of hair like that. We had 5 pairs of his glasses, and I could feel how light they were. His pipe was in there. He had bomb parts. He had the locket that he found around the neck of a woman who had been run over by her own limousine. She owned a limousine company. Her own limousine 6 times ran her over, and clearly was not an accident. And so he kept all of this stuff. And it just seemed like haphazard, but it wasn't. And I had this incredible inventory. So let's flip to the next slide. I have 3 slides of him personally. So this is him in his lab. He's very distinguished, you could tell. And, he always wore 2 or 3-piece suits, and he always had a very sharp haircut. And he was very, very serious in his professional life. And he had to be, because he had a lot of competition. He was the most probably popular, sought after forensic scientist in the country and many times in the world. And so, he really had to kind of bring along with him this Sherlock Holmes reputation. So let's flip to the next slide. And this was part of it. This was, that's his assistant standing above him, and his assistant's wife in the background, and his secretary. And he's putting, a liquid on a doorknob to test for blood. And you could see to the left, that's one of the cameras that those huge cameras he would drag with him to photograph everything. And thank goodness he was an avid photographer, because I had incredible photos that are in the book, like these that really give you a sense of who he was. So the big story that I told you about that I would kind of expand on, I think, is the next slide. So move on to that. Okay, so this was the Siskiyou train robbery. So these are what these terrible train robbers did to this train. It was 3 brothers. They plotted, they loved, like the Black Bart films where it's the Robin Hood, the bad guy is the hero. And they thought, 1923 train robbery, we can do it. There's 3 of us, we're smart enough. But, the government got really smart about US postal trains by probably the turn of the century. And they started putting armed guards on. They started putting all the mail and all the jewelry and everything in safes. So you couldn't just kind of smash and grab anymore. But I don't think they understood that. What they certainly did not understand was how to use dynamite correctly. So when they were able to get the train stopped, they put so much dynamite right at the US Postal Service car where there was a guard that they blew up everything they would have taken with them. So this was the inside of this train, including blowing up essentially the armed guard who was inside, the US Postal Worker armed guard. And then they ended up killing 3 more train workers. And then they're in the wind. Nobody knows who they are. There are no reliable witnesses. There were passengers at the back of the train, but the concussion from that blast shook everyone to a point where nobody really could remember anything. But it was a huge story. And this was the key to Oscar's success, this particular story, the Siskiyou train robbery, because he was under a tremendous amount of pressure to solve it. There were, it was like national newspaper headlines, international headlines, and I call them the worst train robbers ever, because they did all this and they didn't get away with a penny. They got nothing except killing 4 people and ruining their lives. So these 3 boys go on the run, and Oscar is called in as usual. Early in his career, he was not even just playing second fiddle, but like 3rd or 4th fiddle to other forensic scientists who were much less talented. There were a lot of hacks in forensics in the 1920s and 1930s, and just about anybody could claim that they were an expert. And so Oscar was constantly competing with these guys. And you see in the book, there's a lot of rivalry between them. So he was brought in probably about 4 or 5 days later after this happened, which after this train robbery happened, never happened again. He was always the first person called. So in the 1923 train robbery, the big clue, because actually the robbers left behind some clues, some physical clues, but including some guns. They dropped guns. They were really bad robbers. They dropped some guns, but the big deal was a pair of overalls. So let's switch to the next photo. So here are the overalls. Oscar took a door and he suspended it from the ceiling, and he put the overalls against it and pinned it. And then you could see that he measured. So Oscar receives these overalls, and Southern Pacific Railway sent down federal agents, and US Postal sent down federal agents, because the dead people were all federal workers. And they get down there to Oregon, and they look at this pair of overalls, and they do their own analysis first. They didn't want to call him in because he was expensive. So they do their own analysis, and they find a little bit of mechanic's grease on the left pocket. They scrape off and they look, and it's mechanic's grease. So they immediately go and track down the closest mechanic, who was also a ne'er-do-well in the town. And they find him at the mechanic shop. And of course he's greasy, because that's what mechanics work in. And they make him put on these overalls, and the overalls, you know, kind of fit, but not really. And they arrest him. But there's a problem, because the witnesses said they thought there was at least one more robber when there were in fact two. So somebody else is missing. So they put this poor mechanic in jail, and the federal agents are worried. And so they call Oscar Heinrich, who had made headlines 2 years earlier with two big cases that we'll talk about. One of them we'll talk about in a second, which is the Fatty Arbuckle case. But the other case was a priest who was kidnapped in Colma, California, and murdered in 1921. And Oscar's working both cases at the same time. He's doing Fatty Arbuckle and Father Heslin's murder at the same time. And so both of these were huge, huge, huge stories. And especially because in the 1920s, there was a lot of conflict between, you know, the Catholics and Protestants and the various religions. It was very tense. And so this missing priest was a big problem on a lot of different levels. So we're at the train robbery. The federal agents have this guy arrested. They send the overalls to Oscar Heinrich because there's not enough evidence to keep this guy. But the guy's scared. The mechanic's really scared. So Oscar does what he always did. And I can tell from his work journals what he did, because thank goodness he chronicled every second of every day. So I knew that he started at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday and stayed in the lab until I think noon the next day. Didn't take a break, didn't sleep. And he frequently did that. He was in a groove gathering the evidence. So what was unique about Oscar was that we don't have now in forensics, is that he was a generalist. So he knew all of these different disciplines, and he knew them really, really well. He was a trained chemist. He was trained in engineering. He was an expert in sanitation engineering. He held that job. He had been a police chief. He was actually qualified. He was professionally qualified to do all this. So he looks at these overalls, and he comes back and he calls the federal agents in, and they go to Berkeley. They come from Oregon down to Berkeley, and he calls them in, and he says, first thing is, you need to release this mechanic. The guy is not guilty. And they said, but the grease. And he said, that's not mechanic's grease. That's the pitch from a fir tree. And it's from a fir tree in a very specific part of Washington state. And then he goes on to give a really accurate and really comprehensive profile of the owner of these overalls. So if you see the boots at the bottom of the overalls, those are, I don't know why he just happened to have logging boots, but he had the logging boots. So he put logging boots underneath, and he rolled up the cuffs, and it all fit perfectly. He said, this guy's not a mechanic. He's a lumberjack, and he lives in this part. It was like northwestern, I think, of Washington state. He is left-handed. He has light brown hair. He's shorter than 5'10". Actually, I think he might have said 5'9", and then less than 165 pounds. And he's meticulous in his hygiene. And there were a lot of other clues. So he was right about all of this. He could tell from how worn one side of the overalls were than the other, what hand the lumberjack used. He found all kinds of little chips in one pocket that the federal agents had missed. So he could also tell where he was holding this chainsaw when he was cutting, because of the way the chips fell into his pocket. So he had all of these details that were 100% right. And then on top of that, in the front of the overalls, there is a little pencil pocket that the lumberjacks like to use, a little tiny one. They never looked at him. The agents never looked inside. So he took a crochet needle with a little hook in the bottom, and he stuck it into the pocket, and he pulled out a very tiny, he said pea-size, wadded up paper that probably went through the washer, probably was washed at some point, hand washed. He steamed it open, and it was part of a U.S. postal receipt that one of the robbers had sent under a fake name to their brother in Texas. They were able to figure out exactly who they were, and it was 3 de Outremont brothers who were in the wind for 3 years. So he didn't help catch them. He helped identify them, and he profiled them. And there wasn't really criminal profiling in the United States at that point. If they profiled people, it was for insanity pleas later on. It wasn't for trying to predict who the person was. And the FBI didn't have, it would be another 50 years before the FBI would put together their own criminal profiling unit. So, you know, this was really unique that he was able to do that. And if you're interested in criminal profiling, then, you know, in the book, the Father Heslin kidnapping case is excellent with criminal profiling. He was able to very easily, with handwriting, predictably say that the suspect was a baker, a professional baker. And I'm not going to tell you how he knew that, but he knew he was a professional baker, and he was right. So, you know, all of this earned him this nickname of America's Sherlock Holmes. So I know we're going to have to wrap up in just a few minutes. Let's go to the last slide, please, Courtney. So herein lies the problem with Oscar Heinrich and with forensics in general. In 2009, the National Academy of Sciences came out with a scathing report about forensics and about the things that are wrong with forensics. And there's a lot of wrong things with forensics. There's a lot of junk science, and to a certain extent, fingerprinting is a big problem. So fingerprinting falls under what we call pattern matching. So, you know, when I put my fingerprint down, and then it's up to an analyst to compare that fingerprint to another fingerprint of either, you know, something that a murder weapon, something that's on the scene. So this is the case of Fatty Arbuckle. And actually, so we don't have to go backwards, I'll grab the book. So on the cover of the book, you see a handprint. This is kind of my little inside joke. This is Fatty Arbuckle's handprint. So Oscar had to go down to, actually, I think he was happy because he hated Fatty Arbuckle, but he went down to the jail and got him, you know, a handprint done, and, you know, for evidence. And this is a handprint that, you know, Oscar put powder on, and you could see very clearly on the door of the suite where this supposed manslaughter case happened, where Fatty Arbuckle, who's this huge silent film star, throws a really big party in 1921 at a hotel in San Francisco, real swank party. And it was sleazy, basically, I think, sleazy Hollywood people combined with showgirls, which is probably never a good combination, and a lot of prohibition whiskey and gin. And so everybody got sloshed, of course. And Fatty Arbuckle disappears with Virginia Rapay behind a door. And the next thing you know, a few hours later, she's complaining of horrible stomach pains and she dies. So Oscar goes into the suite 2 weeks too late. Again, he's brought in way too late at the beginning of his career. And he, you know, finds these handprints, which he says is indicative of a struggle. So you've got the really big handprint of Fatty Arbuckle's, right? And then on top of it to the side, you've got a smaller handprint, which we would presume is Virginia Rapay's. The problem is that with most of the time with handprints that you find on a murder weapon or in a scene somewhere, they aren't perfect prints. So if you think about it, I don't know if anybody has had the misfortune to go down to the DMV lately, but I had to. And you know, you have to do that thumbprint thing where you roll on the glass. It took me 3 times to do it. I don't know if it takes you guys, I mean, the older you get, you know, the less fingerprinting you have. And so you can't have a perfect fingerprint. So look at that fingerprint. Look at what he did. And he was able to perfectly match these fingerprints as if it looked like they were in a struggle to Virginia Rapay and Fatty Arbuckle. And that is junk science, and it is inaccurate. And Oscar's testimony, and because of the fact that he hated Hollywood and he thought all women should be wearing corsets and, you know, there should be chaperones at dances, you know, all of his bias and his credibility at that point triggered mistrial after mistrial after mistrial until finally, I think on the 4th trial, Fatty Arbuckle was acquitted. And that was it. it ruined his career. It didn't matter whether he was guilty or innocent. And incidentally, there was absolutely no evidence that he was guilty. And he unfortunately has a reputation of being this sleazy killer. And it's just legally, there's nothing there really. So, this book was really satisfying for me to write. It reminded me a lot of like my dad and the things that we would talk about. And I think it's an important book because I do think it resonates with us today. We still have problems with forensics. We still have problems with egotistical scientists who sit on the stand and contradict each other, and confusing juries beyond belief. And we still have a justice system that needs work. So this has been, a great time for me. So we can do questions if anybody has any questions.
This is Patricia. I'm one of the moderators, and I've had a burning question since you started this story. You'd mentioned that there was so much data in the archive and that you were in a warehouse full of data while they were going through it. So was that overwhelming, or how did you sift through all that information to kind of find the information that for the story that you wanted to tell?
Well, it was overwhelming into it. I mean, the only thing that saved me, and the only reason that I was able to write this book, was because of the archivist at UC Berkeley. She was willing to take it on, and she said initially, I was given 1.5 years to write the book, which is not very much time. And she said, it's going to take me 2 years to get through this archive. And I said, I don't have 2 years. So she said, probably I can do it in 10 months. And I said, well, what am I going to do in the meantime? So all of the letters that he ever had were just put that they were not have, you didn't have to catalog them. I could have access immediately. So they were put in chronological order and sort of haphazardly organized. And so she said, there's 4,000 letters. So you're going to have 10 months to read through all those letters and figure out who he is. And then I'll help you sort out the cases. So in the meantime, she is going through his 2,000 cases and figuring out, what are the violent cases, which of course is what I want, and what are the handwriting cases. He did a lot of verification of wills, handwriting and wills and stuff like that. And he had a lot of boring cases too, and cases that just never went anywhere. And so I emailed her and did another thing that's kind of embarrassing, sort of like the book where I just bought this book and found this guy. I asked the archivist, what are his 15 thickest cases? What are the ones where you have the most information? Because that's what I need. I need his work journals. I need his trial transcripts that no longer exist anywhere else but with him. I need all of that information. And so she sent me a list, and I narrowed it down to 7 or 8. I can't even remember how many in the book. And thank goodness it was really, really helpful. And eventually, if I were going to go back now, I would have a better grasp of what was in there. But I had to go in with a game plan. I usually just go in and frantically take photographs. I read very famous narrative nonfiction authors who love to go in the archives. And I think I kind of picture them sort of slowly gathering information and going to their hotels and sitting by the fireplace with a cat and drinking, cognac at night and flipping through the stuff. And that's not how I do things at all. I am frantically taking photographs and sweating essentially from the time the archive opens until it closes. And it's been like that with every project I've ever done. I just don't even read it. I just photograph. If it's there, I'm going to take a picture of it and I'll toss it out later. So, I would be much better organized. But without the help of Laura Michaels, would not have happened for sure.
Great. So there is a few questions coming in. One person missed the introduction. So can you just recap really quickly what classes you teach at UT?
Oh yeah, I didn't even say that. So thank you for bringing that up. So I'm in the journalism school. And I teach, I used to teach a lot of television news because TV news was, a large part of my background. But now I teach documentary for news. So think about the stories that you would see maybe on the New York Times on their op-ed page, their video page, the things that New Yorker has, Vice. So I teach students how to make those type of documentaries, but kind of geared towards a news audience. So that's what I teach predominantly.
All right. A couple of questions about Oscar coming in, and I didn't catch this in the lecture, but one was, what was life like for Oscar after his reputation was ruined?
Well, I think that he had a difficult time, when he would become embarrassed. I mean, he had an awful lot of missteps, and I would never say his life was ruined, but I think that his life would become more complicated when he would have public embarrassments. And a lot of those were unfounded. They were, he would make mistakes and he would lose cases, but where it hurt him the most, as you'll see kind of in the middle of the book, there's a case that just involves bullet striations, markings on a bullet. It's a very simple case. It's not the sexiest case in the world, but it was really pivotal for him because he had to finally face down a professional enemy who had just been, trying to discredit him for decades. And so I think that he found that really disconcerting. And I think he never showed it, but it really did damage to him kind of internally.
And you think it's just because he was such a perfectionist?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
You're in the public eye. I mean, if you're in the public eye like that, and your professional reputation is everything, and you have somebody constantly trying to discredit you, which is that's what forensic experts do. I mean, that's what any expert witness does. Your job is to contradict what happens on the other side. So, you're inherently setting up an adversarial relationship with whoever is on the other team. So it's stressful for anybody.
Yeah. Along those lines, are you willing to share any notable cases that he wasn't able to solve?
Let's see. Any notable cases? Well, there's one in the book, which was, I think, probably pretty upsetting for him. It's pretty gruesome. That's why I didn't include the pictures. So he, right in the middle of the book in 1925, he was sent an ear attached to a scalp, and they couldn't even figure out if it was a male or a female, and he determined it was a woman. And they just essentially said, the police in Alameda County said, we essentially have no idea where the rest of the body is. That was all that was found in a marsh. And they had dragged the marsh and drained it and done everything, and they couldn't find the rest of the body. So clearly somebody had killed this person and dismembered and then spread the body parts everywhere. And he determined it was a woman. He determined who it was. And eventually he, using 1 grain of sand and his analysis, was able to track down the body location 12 miles away from where the ear was found. So it was a pretty amazing feat for him. But, not that I want to ruin it, but he ultimately was not able to solve who did it. He found her, which was what was important to her parents, but he couldn't figure out who did it. He had some pretty strong suspects, though.
I'm going to combine a couple of questions. I think we're going to talk about this in a minute, but if you want to tell us a little bit about your podcast that's coming out and what true crime podcasts that you like to listen to. And then the second part of that is, what do you think of all the CSI series on TV?
CSI, well, because I laughed. Maybe I'll start with that. Well, you all have heard about the CSI effect, which is not as pertinent now because I don't think CSI is as big of a deal now as it used to be. I don't know where it is in the ratings, but so, the CSI effect is that you, jurors, are sitting at home watching CSI and you see that it is the only rock solid way to keep a killer off the streets and in prison. And so when you, the juror, sit in the juror's chair and listen to a case, you expect all of that. You expect DNA. You expect, the bullet striations, all the fancy stuff that you see on CSI. Jurors now demand it because that's what they think is real evidence. And it was interesting. I could probably do this demonstration. There's a prosecutor who I knew who used to talk about circumstantial evidence. So circumstantial evidence is not forensic evidence, right? It's all the other stuff. It could be a eyewitness. It could be, telephone records, all of these little pieces that are not DNA and the things that we're used to seeing. So if you take a case that is DNA with this one piece of information, the defense attorney can probably say that there is cross-contamination in that lab because I think many labs have had that happen. and put reasonable doubt on your one little piece of evidence used to put away this killer, right? But if you have a circumstantial case, so if you've got eyewitnesses, right, you've got telephone records, you've got tire tracks, you've got a motive, then all of a sudden you can't break that case. So a lot of prosecutors will say they want a strong circumstantial case than a DNA case or one piece of evidence. Like, God forbid somebody goes to prison on fingerprints. That would be horrible because it's unreliable. So there's CSI. That's the CSI question, which I'm not sure it did great things for anything except it was really good entertainment. On top of that, the true crime stuff, I think, because it has become such a big deal, true crime is such an incredibly huge growing category. Thank goodness I actually enjoy it. And I enjoy writing about it. So I am joining a network, and my podcast is going to launch November 23rd, but the trailer will, what they call drop, if you don't know podcasts, the trailer will drop on November 2nd. So if you know anything about true crime, you probably know about this show. The show's called My Favorite Murder, and it's the biggest true crime podcast on the planet. And it's two comedians who are fantastic and hilarious, and they just talk about true crime and they talk about themselves. So my show is connected to their show. And my show is called Tenfold More Wicked. And Tenfold More Wicked is my smarty, kind of my way of trying to insert literature in anything I do. So Tenfold More Wicked is a phrase that came out of Jekyll and Hyde, Stevenson's novel, Jekyll and Hyde. And it's where Dr. Jekyll describes his transformation into Mr. Hyde as tenfold more wicked than he was before. So Tenfold More Wicked is very much like my books. It's not about the two books at all. They don't cross over. But for instance, I do 6 episodes per season, and the first season is about a man from the 19th century, from Gilded Age, New York, who was a killer, but he was also a genius. And ultimately, when he was caught, he was a genius in linguistics. He said that he had this huge discovery in linguistics, which in the 19th century would have been a really big deal. And when he was caught and he was told he would be executed, people like Mark Twain and Republican candidate Horace Greeley came to his defense and said, this guy shouldn't be killed. He is too smart to go to the gallows. We need to save his life. And ultimately, I'm not going to tell you what ended up, but he did make history in a pretty significant way, but not in the way that he thought he was going to make history. And so that podcast will be, there's a lot of like great sounds, and I do interviews where I talk about the insanity defense. And another season I talk about, in a season about body snatchers, I talk about why people donate cadavers now. And so I kind of go on a field trip with myself to the body farm at Texas State University, which is the largest forensic anthropological site in the world, where you can donate your body and help solve crimes. And so the podcast is been a lot of fun to work on, a lot of hard work, but a lot of fun. And true crime podcasts that I like a lot. There are a lot of a lot of the stuff on Wondery I think is really good. It's hard to go wrong with Dirty John or Tiger King or Over My Dead Body. And my buddy was a producer on Over My Dead Body. So those are some really interesting podcasts. My podcast is definitely true crime, but it feels a little bit more like this podcast called Lore, which is super creepy and, spooky. It's kind of like scary bedtime stories. And I have a fantastic composer who is really incredible with music. So it's a pretty spooky, scary, my kids who are 11 aren't allowed to listen to it kind of podcast.
Okay, great. We're all going to listen to it now. So
my pitch is right on. Fantastic.
So we've got about 6 more minutes, but I want to ask just a couple of questions that are coming in. One was a question from one of our viewers is, what was the name of the red book that you showed at the beginning?
Don't steal this book. Remember, all my books, all my future books are coming from this book. So here it is. It's called Blood Letters and Batman, which is just about the best title of a book ever.
That's a great title.
By Robert Nash. And it's huge. So this thing is 640 pages long. And honestly, I stopped right at the Siskiyou train robbery. So I haven't looked at the rest of it yet. But when I get stumped for projects, I always go back to this book, which is kind of embarrassing, but you got to do what you got to do. I mean, you know, I have a family to feed. I need to keep writing books.
For sure. And then another person just wanted to verify that it's worldcat.org.
Yes,
Yes.
worldcat.org. And I love that web, and all librarians know that website. I love that website because what you do is you can plug in the search, and it could be a book. Like you could just you could plug in my name, Kate Winkler Dawson, into worldcat.org, and it will show you my 2 books. And then it'll show you not where to buy them. It'll show you the libraries where they're located. So, you know, it'll tell you if it's at the University of Texas Library, which one. So I use interlibrary loan a lot through UT since I teach there. And so I got like trial transcripts from my serial killer case from London. You know, I had them shipped in because I knew exactly it was at the British Library. I knew exactly where it was. So it's a really, really good resource.
Okay, another quick, I'm trying to combine a couple of questions. So just off the top of your head, what's your favorite crime novel? And then can you tell us just real quick about any of your stories that may be optioned or made into films or documentaries?
Oh yeah, so you've started with the crime novel. Okay, so I will say it is my favorite is a nonfiction crime novel, and it is for sure In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. And it is, to me, I'll tell you, it is a crime novel. It's supposed to be a nonfiction book, but he didn't source anything, which is unbelievable. Like if you look at my book, American Sherlock, right? If you look at the back of it, I am so meticulous about my notes because I don't want to get called out. I don't want somebody to say, this isn't right. Where did she get this information? She made this all up. And Truman Capote I don't think there's anything in the back of his book at all. So it's a novel. So I'm going to go with In Cold Blood, even though it's supposed to be nonfiction.
That's beautiful. One other person was curious.
I'm sorry. You asked about the optioning and stuff.
Yeah.
Into that. So the first book was optioned by Miramax, and they're turning that the Deaf in the Air. Hold on, I'll get a thing on it. And it is being turned into see, this is what the photo is what drew me. I found this photo, and that's how I found about the Great Smog of 1952 was this woman, you know, with the chiffon scarf, which I think all of us can relate to at this point.
Yeah.
She, that book was optioned and is going to be turned into a fictional series, live action series with actors. It's been written already, and they're just waiting for us to get out of this COVID or to a point where they feel comfortable having people shoot a TV series. And then I don't know if I'm supposed to say this or not. The second book, so American Sherlock, is being turned into a docu-series on Netflix. So Netflix bought it, and we are in development on it right now. So that's been really exciting. So
all of us Netflix, true crime junkies are so excited for you, and we're excited for us too.
So. Yeah, it's good. So, you know, the production company, I'll just mention this because maybe somebody, I watch a lot more TV than I listen to podcasts. And so, you know, the people who are making my podcast or making the TV series about American Sherlock, they made 2 true crime podcasts. One is Fear City, which is on Netflix. It's about the mafias in New York. And the other one, which was far more fascinating to me, was, I can't say it on, but Don't F with Cats. I don't know if anybody's seen that. It's an unbelievable documentary series on Netflix that they did. And so there's a lot of really interesting stuff out there that's being made.
Wow. I've seen one of them that you mentioned, and it is really pretty great. So are there, this is going to be probably the last question, but, you know, we've all probably watched Gone in the Dark or listened to the podcast. And, you know, she goes out of her way to really say that, you know, all of these police people and laymen were so dedicated to trying to find this murderer. You know, do you find that dedication is there and that's still happening, and it's really about that footwork, so to speak, and doing that sort of, you know, and being so not letting it go, because that's, just not letting it go.
Being diligent about it. Yeah, I think so. I think that, I mean, I think it's like in any profession, you have really, really good people, hopefully, that are, you know, the norm in the profession. And then you have people who might not care as much. But I think being an investigator, and certainly being an attorney, a prosecutor, a defense attorney, it's all so much hard work. I mean, it's so draining. And I just think, thank goodness they keep going, and they keep going after these cases. And so on the network, on my podcast, the network I'm joining is another show called Murder Squad. And that show is hosted by Paul Holes and Billy Jensen. And if you have seen you know, Gone in the Dark with Michelle McNamara, if you've seen it or heard of it, both of those guys were heavily involved in the case, in the Golden State Killer case. So, you know, there's a lot of, it's the hard part about true crime is there's sort of a lot of entertainment value. I don't know if you know this, but the far biggest majority of audience in true crime is women. It is unreal. It's like 20-1 or something, people who listen to true crime. And there are a lot of theories behind why women are the main audience, but, you know, it's such a satisfying world to be in, because it's a world, hopefully none of us have to go into.
Yeah. Well, I think that's going to be our last question. You are such a gifted lecturer. We really appreciate your time. You know, just a huge thank you. You're always wonderful. So we hope that you'll come back and talk with us again. And your books, again, for anyone, they're so interesting, but for you know, our crime junkie audience, this is amazing. And I'm looking forward to reading it myself. So thank you. And also, you know, we hope everyone enjoyed learning more about American Sherlock Holmes, Oscar Heinrich. And, you know, you can purchase Professor Dawson's book, American Sherlock, Murder, Forensics, and the Birth of American CSI at your local bookstore or online. And don't forget to sign up for Professor Dawson's newsletter. She'll keep you up to date with the latest news on her books and the upcoming podcast. And I think you can find the link to sign up in the QA chat right now. So thank you again, Professor, for taking the time to speak with the Texas Exes today. And audience, we also would really love to thank you one more time. You're a wonderful audience. We really appreciate it that you come and listen to all the wonderful speakers that we present to you, and for participating in the September Lunchtime Lecture. And we also want to thank, a big thanks to all those Texas Exes that donated when you registered. Your ongoing support allows us to continue to bring new and exciting content to alumni and friends across the globe. So we couldn't do it without you. Thank you so much. And speaking of new content, we're excited to share details for our fall lectures. So be sure and join us in October to catch up on our current events, how current events have affected the financial world, with Professor Stanford Leeds from Macomb School of Business. And I've been practicing his name for 2 minutes now, and I still said Stanford. His name is Sanford Leeds. And in November, we'll be exploring ways in which social media has affected the 2020 election and other political events with Dr. Sam Woolley from the Moody College of Communication. So that one's going to be a pretty interesting conversation as well. You can register for both of these right now at texasexes.org/lunchtime lectures. And one last update from Texas Exes. Ring Week is happening right now. It's happening online and in person at the Alumni Center. And you can join over 51,000 Longhorns in a time-honored tradition today by visiting texasexes.org/rings. So thank you again for your time today, and thank you for joining. And we look forward to seeing everyone at our next Lunchtime Lecture. Thanks, guys.